All right, thank you everybody for coming out to the ultimate Dreamforce showdown between the org-based administrators and the source-based developers. My name is Bill Appleton. I'm the CTO over at Metazoa, and I'm a developer who builds a product for admins, our snapshot org management tool. And I also wrote some of the very first AppExchange applications all the way back in 2005. And actually, that's when I met Dave Carroll. And Dave has done a lot of things for both developers and admins at Salesforce over the last 15 years. I'll leave the rest of the introduction to you, Dave.
All right, well, thanks, Bill. Can you hear me all right out there? Sounds pretty loud, actually, doesn't it? How was Dreamfest? Everybody go to Dreamfest? Pretty fun? Awesome. Well, thanks for making it here this morning to hear us. My name's Dave. Product manager here at Salesforce. First 14 years at Salesforce, I was in developer evangelism. So I've seen the platform grow quite a bit. And what we want to do today really is try to make some clear statements about how to think about different kinds of development. Since the introduction of DX, there's been a lot of talk about source development versus org development and so on. And so I think there's still a little bit of confusion, and hopefully we'll clarify some of that. I don't think we're actually going to do any kind of knockdown, drag out kind of deal, are we?
It's not a cage match.
Okay, so with that, we're going to get to the FLS slide. Anybody know what FLS is? It's not field level security. Forward-looking statements. So anything that we talk about here today that is not GA, don't really depend on that to make your buying decisions. Really don't depend on that for any investing decisions. Make all your decisions based on what is GA. So let's get into it. I mentioned that I've seen the platform evolve. It's continuing to evolve. It's continuing to mature. Part of that is the capabilities, but another big part of that is the place in which it occupies inside of organizations today. Bigger and bigger companies are adopting the platform to build applications to customize our various clouds. And with that comes new requirements that probably didn't exist 10 years ago for app dev on the platform. Things like governance, compliance, to be an enterprise-ready platform, an enterprise-class platform, you need other things like release management. You have multiple developers, multiple admins. Some companies have multiple orgs, up to 20, 30, 40 orgs. And so that means that we have to think about the way that we work a little bit differently. Certainly the size of your company and the size of your implementation will affect the way that you treat the development on the platform. But I think that if you start with a good knowledge of the best practices, the pros and cons of the different approaches from the beginning, you'll be better positioned as you grow. And so we're going to be talking about some of those best practices as we move forward.
Great. So, you know, the org-based administration of Salesforce has been around for a long time. Lots been written about it. It's really all about how admins can respond to the evolving business needs of their company, make sure that the users are happy, make sure that the Salesforce platform and technology is really achieving the business goals that they have. And this is especially change and release management in the release cycle. As you know, every 4 months there's a new version of Salesforce, and 2 months before that your sandboxes are updated. So user acceptance testing, integration testing, and then being sure that that production org is ready to go for those users on a regular basis. And so, you know, a lot's been written about org-based administration, and really just jumping right into the heart of it is the setup menu. And so this is kind of a humorous slide I have for the setup menu.
I call those the admin monkeys.
Those are the admin monkeys.
I'm a source guy.
That's the source. So the setup menu works great. It's a wonderful way to modify a Salesforce org. Clicks not code for admins to build applications. Developers can write Apex there. You can customize that org there. But for big companies that are interested in compliance and security, it can be a little daunting. They really want to know, what are the customizations in my Salesforce org? How have they changed? What are they going to be in the future? Can we audit them? Can we document them? That type of thing. And so, you know, the classic story of the setup menu is, it's the day before your big release management, you know, your big deployment, and somebody goes into the setup menu and changes something and your deployment fails. So, you know, that's kind of why I have this humorous picture there of the monkeys. But if big companies and org administrators have this compliance concern, it's really even more of an issue for developers, because developers really need to know, this is the version of software that I wrote, these are the changes that I made, and here's the next version of my software. And so it really kind of dovetails with the concerns about source-based development.
Yeah, and what I like about this picture, aside from the joke about admin monkeys, is that we tend to think in terms of singular admins or singular developers, especially if we're new to the platform or we're in a smaller organization, but that's not the case. We'll have multiple admins, multiple developers working on either same project or orthogonal projects, and then the release management and the compliance really come to the fore there. So when we talk about source-based development, we're talking about really not the format of the files, but actually taking the metadata down locally. If you're writing code, editing the code locally, that's clearly source files. That's the easy way that we think about it. But all the metadata that represents whatever the solution is that you're working on is source. And to contrast it with org development, what we think of with source development is, what is the source of truth? Does it reside in an org, or does it reside in our files? And to support this, we need new tools. This is why you see things like the CLI, VS Code as a replacement for Eclipse, as well as our Scratch orgs, all these things that will help with release management, assuming that you can adopt at least some part of your source as physical files as the source of truth. And by doing that, it allows us to better hook into these CI/CD systems. We can store this in a repository. It gives us a nice history. If we're just storing or using our org as our source of truth without the benefit of source code control, then we lose a lot of that history, that auditability, figuring out what changed when, and thereby being able to maybe fix something that broke in the future. And so I mentioned the tooling. So this is actually represented by Salesforce DX. Hands for people who have heard of Salesforce DX, right? Great, wow, we did a good job of disseminating that, which is good. But there's a little bit of confusion, I think, as to what Salesforce DX is, or there has been since we released it. And it's not a singular product, per se. It's a collection of tools. Things like Scratch orgs, the tooling. Part of Salesforce DX is also second-generation packages, which we're going to talk a lot more about in this session. And Salesforce DX was compiled, all these tools were compiled to better enable more standard software development practices around the whole development application lifecycle, which includes the interactive part while you're developing locally. For instance, not technically a part of DX, but the DX tooling supports it, and that is the ability to develop Lightning Web Components locally. In other words, you can view your Lightning Web Component in a hosted web server on your local machine instead of having to deploy it up into the cloud to see your changes and so on. The ability to track changes in Scratch orgs, which references the push and pull bullet there. So Scratch orgs and now sandboxes have the ability to do what we call source tracking. If you've heard of change data capture, right, this is a feature that we have on the platform so that you can consume events, platform events that represent when data changes as opposed to like triggers and some other things. Our push and pull and our source tracking is akin to change data capture for metadata. And so that way, if I'm working with source of truth being the files on my system or my repository, and I go into my Scratch org and do some declarative work, which by the way is shouldn't be something you avoid if you consider yourself a developer. It's very important that you understand those capabilities. But we can track those changes so that we can bring down those changes and keep our source of truth up to date. And then unlocked packages are part of the second-gen packaging that we introduced. It's GA as of this release, which is fantastic, with some caveats, but we'll fix those in coming releases. But unlocked packages are kind of the next step in thinking about your source being your source of truth. You also now have something that you can consider a unit of deployment. And when you're creating a solution on the platform, whether it's a standalone app or some kind of extension to CRM or Sales Cloud, you can create packages that represent that unit of deployment. And so now you've got versioning. You have the ability to update those in a reasonable way. You can delete them and so on. And so that's a key element for the source driven.
Great, thanks, Dave. So what does this really look like at a customer? And when I talk to our customers, you know, it varies widely, but in general, there's usually fewer developers and probably more admins. The developers are usually much more specialized into building apps and writing code. The admins are much more generalized into being sure that the org is accomplishing all the needs of the company and that all the users are happy. A lot of times the admins are running the show, but sometimes the developers are running the show. It just kind of depends. But in general, this is a large team working together. And so, you know, traditionally it was really probably just the admins, and now the developers are here. So that's, you know, that's interesting because we've had best practices for admins, and now we're talking about best practices for developers. And it's really time to have the conversation, how can these two groups work together to make release management more effective and software development more effective? And, you know, you hear about the accidental admin who's maybe been working on the Salesforce platform for a decade or so. You don't hear about accidental developers, right? I mean, developers are, you know, JavaScript experts in React framework, or they're, you know, from the Java world or the enterprise world. And so what's interesting to me is that the developers are, you know, a very talented bunch, but sometimes it's the admins who really understand the magic of the Salesforce platform. At any rate, the developers tend to use more procedural tools like Salesforce DX, which Dave just talked about, Visual Studio Code, and the admins tend to use more declarative tools like the setup menu and change sets. And there's other things like Scratch orgs, which really are on both sides of that fence.
Yeah, and I think the key to this slide is that there's a continuum here. Some business analysts are admins. Some admins do development work.
Absolutely.
Some administrators are architects as well, right? So there's a continuum there. And I think that it's really important to understand as developers how you can leverage some of the declarative features of the platform. For instance, flows, right? If you don't understand that you can invoke flows from your Apex code, then you're missing out on an enabler for your administrators who are very familiar with flows. And so by leveraging flows, you're also giving the admin the ability to make changes without having to go back and recompile all your Apex and stuff like that. So it's very important that that Venn diagram stays intact.
So one really interesting thing to look at that's kind of a divider between org-based and source-based is where is your metadata? And so if you're a developer, you're probably on the left-hand side of this slide, and your metadata might be on your hard disk in a folder, and you could edit it there or use code editors, and then you can push it into Scratch orgs. You can create second-generation packages and do things like that. If you're an admin, you might be working with metadata more in the actual org. And so that's on the far right-hand side. And so, but working in a repo, like GitHub, is kind of a middle case that either a developer or an admin might want to work at. I wanted to just say a couple things quickly about repos. Sometimes when I talk to customers, they say, we finally got our entire production org uploaded to GitHub. And I say, well, great, but why did you do it? And they're like, well, if it's for compliance or security or backup, that's a good reason. But really, if you're putting gigantic quantities of XML and metadata in a repo, it's difficult. It's not really human readable. Repos don't do a good job of merging XML. So I think the main reason to use repos is for code merge and development teams. So I think the repos are more on the source-based side of the equation and more useful there. They can also be used as a place to hand off metadata to an admin. So if you think about it, the developer could be on a shared drive and hand off metadata that way. They could use unlocked packages. That's really an org-based technology. And then repos are another way to get the work of a developer and put it into your repo. But what you need to realize is, if you put a new custom object as a local file, then you just changed one file. If you create a custom object in a repo, you just changed one file. But if you create a new custom object in an org, there are going to be hundreds or thousands of other reflected changes to that object. It's connected to tabs and profiles and page layouts and all these other things. And that's the magic of the Salesforce platform. So there really is a difference between source-based things and org-based things. In particular, org-based things are always consistent. And what that means is when you pull metadata from an org, when you retrieve it, it's always consistent. That almost always works. But when you deploy metadata to an org, it either works or doesn't work based on what you send it. And you have to be sure that it's consistent before you deploy it. So just because you put a file in a local repo or in a local project doesn't mean you can deploy it to an org. And because of this, developers tend to work with fewer metadata types than administrators. Developers tend to work with Apex classes, custom objects, custom tabs, lightning components, those types of things. But administrators often deal with the other 200 metadata types that customize the rest of the platform.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. That's not to say that you're not concerned as a developer with the other 200 parts. You may have them locally, but you're probably not going to be working with them. You have them locally so that you can satisfy dependencies that might arise in any kind of packages or deployments that you're creating. So yeah, if you're using a repo for backing up your entire org, I would suggest that you go look at some of the partner solutions for backing up your org instead. So continuous integration, we mentioned it briefly in passing already. Continuous integration, I think, is even some of the smallest companies that are just starting out realize the importance of continuous integration. I think historically we've not been able to support it well for our administrators and our org-based development, and so we want to change that. We want to change the mindset of all the admins out there. Continuous integration does a lot of things, especially as you start to grow and you have people working on different projects, and you need to integrate those into an org where you compile everything before you deploy it, right? Your integration org. The best way to do that is with existing tools that we have, and to be able to automate that so that you don't work for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and then go to integrate. You're ready to deploy on the following Monday, and now something's not integrating together. So the more frequently you do that, the more assurance that you have that everything will integrate. So that talks to the difficulty of org merges, right?
Yeah, so one of the things we do is we supply tools to people who are doing complex org mergers, clones, and divisions. And it's interesting because if you have two really complex Salesforce orgs and you're trying to make them look the same, both in the metadata and the data, that's a big project that can take weeks of manual effort. And so continuous integration is another interesting technology that's kind of between org-based and source-based. It works great for teams of developers But if you have too many metadata types or the orgs are too different, continuous integration can start to fail and break down. And then you've got to flip over to regular org-based technologies and metadata, manual metadata things to fix the orgs and get your continuous integration engine back up and running again. So it's interesting. It's another kind of dividing line between the org-based and the source-based.
Yeah, and so that last bullet is an interesting one. Bill tends to talk about it as entangled assets. I think we've referred to it as the happy soup in the past. And continuous integration will help you understand some of that because the dependencies will be exposed and things like that. But we're going to talk more about how to handle the entangled assets in a few minutes. So, unpackaged metadata. Go ahead, Bill.
Absolutely.
I love this slide.
Absolutely. So, if you just download all the metadata in a Salesforce org without packages, it will all kind of come down in silos. And all the custom objects will be in one folder, all the Apex classes will be in another folder, profiles and so on and so forth for all of those different metadata types. And this is pretty good for compliance, it's pretty good for backup, but it's really not what a developer wants. And so if you think about the rise of Salesforce DX and all of that, that's to provide an experience that's more of what developers want, especially that enterprise developer. So we can go to the next.
Yeah, well, I just want to interject if I might, Bill.
Sure.
This reminds me of when you're a kid, right, and you buy the Legos. And so you get your Millennium Falcon, and you build your Millennium Falcon, and then you get your X-Wing fighter, and you build that thing. And then, what if you took all those pieces and just categorized them by their shapes? How are you going to get that back together again, right? So this to me is like the Lego slide.
Yeah, I like it. So this is really what a developer is looking for. They want to see not the vertical silos, but the horizontal packages where a team of developers can do an agile development process focused on a particular project that includes multiple metadata types, and then they can iterate on the versions of that project, creating new packages as they go along. This is really much more the developer mindset. And this is why second-generation packages are so important, and we're going to spend some time on that. They're really the handoff point between the developer and then where the admin takes it from there in terms of integration testing and user acceptance.
Yeah, and I would back that up a little bit by thinking about that previous slide and thinking about this slide. If I'm just spraying metadata into an org, for me to track down what changed, what might be causing a problem, what the element is that I need to go back and revisit, it's going to be very hard. If I've created a unit of deployment, like a package, and I deploy that package, I know it's something in that package, and I know exactly what's in that package because I have a manifest that tells me what's in that package. And so that gives me a place to go back to. Also, we can prevent partial deployments of metadata using kind of the traditional technologies, but this is impossible to partially deploy bad code. If it doesn't deploy, then you haven't messed up anything. You don't have something in a incoherent state or an unknown state. So we're going to talk a little bit about the ALM process, the continuous integration, because this is the core of the things that you need to know when you're thinking about org-based versus package-based. And you'll notice that I'm switching my terminology here. So it's not really a question of source versus org. It's org versus package when it comes to deployment. I would argue that source should always be your source of truth instead of an org. And hopefully I can illustrate how you can manage that regardless of what kind of development you do. So this is our more traditional source-based org development, if you will. And so you'll notice that there is a source code control repository in this diagram. And so this is basically, I've got developers, they've got a sandbox, they retrieve all the metadata that they feel is sufficient for them to work on their solution. They build their solution, and then ultimately the next step is to push it into a source code repository. We're not going to try to sync it to another org, deploy from our dev edition into our integration org. That's not the right way to do it because multiple developers might have dependencies that they need to wait for other developers to get in place before they actually do that deployment. And so once we've got it in the source code, then we can go ahead and integrate all these projects by deploying it to the integration or build swim lane there. And in the traditional non-packaged way of thinking about this is that would be your packaging org. And so you get all your new metadata up in there, you test it out, you adjust the manifest for your package, and then you will cut a package from that org and then install it in your test environment and then ultimately in your release environment. So this is package-based org development. I should mention that when I talk about this, this is second-gen packaging versus first-gen. The first one is first-gen. And the big difference here is that when we create our package, what we're doing is we're creating it from the source. So second-generation packages allow you to point at a set of files and say, make this my package. There is no packaging org in this case. The org that keeps track of the package versions that you've got, whether they're beta or released and whatnot, is your dev hub at this point. And so, again, we're using sandboxes or could be dev editions, whatever, for our development. We put it in the source code control repository, and then we push it into our build. Now, instead of using that as a packaging org, we build the beta package actually from the source. I think I have a line missing on this drawing. And so it should go from the source into the partial sandbox. That would be our beta package where we would test it, make sure everything's okay. And then the next step would be simply to take that same package, take the same assets that you use for your beta package from your repository, and then create a released package out of it. And then you can test that for UAT, your training, production org, whatever. And so this is the package-based source development model where the source of truth truly is the source code repository. And in this case, because we have designed our solution from the beginning to think about it as the unit of deployment from when we start as being a package, then we can do things like leverage scratch orgs. So instead of sandboxes, my developers are spinning up scratch orgs. Where this matters is in your CI and CD, because we can script that scratch org creation, we can script all the deployment, we can script ultimately the building of the packages. But once we're done in the scratch org, we pull our changes down locally that we've done declaratively and all our programmatic changes, stick them into the source code repository. And at this point, hopefully what you're doing is you're creating a pull request, which is essentially the way to think about it, if you're unfamiliar with this, is we're firing a trigger that announces to the integration, the CI system, that we've just put a stake in the ground and now go run some builds, maybe run our tests, make sure everything integrates, and this is all done automatically. And then again, once we're happy with our integration, we've got everything working, we go back to our repository, create our beta package, test it out in our testing swim lane, and then likewise create the release and test it out in the other two places. And so this is the model that we want to encourage everyone to get to. As you can see, it's not that different from the previous slide. We're still using packages, and we're still thinking of the source code, the representation that ultimately gets in the package as our source of truth. And so it works both ways.
All right, thanks, Dave. That's fantastic. Using source-based package development is really the key technology moving forward for app dev on the Salesforce platform. One of the reasons packages matter so much is they are a key method, probably the best method, of reducing the complexity of your Salesforce org. Why does that matter? Well, if your Salesforce org is getting more complex every day, at some point it's going to become unusable. It starts to slow down the agility of your company. It starts to slow down your developers. And, complexity is really a big issue, especially these assets listed at lower right. It's kind of an n-squared problem. These things can just explode in complexity. And so, we spend a lot of times working with customers to try to simplify that. And what's great about packages is they kind of back out all the complexity into a single unit that you can control, and it's really very helpful. And so this is how I like to look at it, is you see the complexity of all that unpackaged metadata kind of gets reduced, and then you have applications that are coherent and are kind of standalone, and it reduces the complexity of that org. And so I think about it as a developer almost like object code versus source code. On the left, you've got object code. It's important and it runs, but it's hard to know what it's doing. On the right, you've got source code. That's human readable, it has more meaning, and it really helps you clarify and simplify your org.
Yeah, I mean, this is really the goal. I think it would be hard to argue that this isn't a good idea in theory, right? I mean, if you can take a big problem and make it into a bunch of smaller problems, that's a good approach for solving many different kinds of problems. But the reality is, it gets a little difficult, right? Because we have entanglements. We've got dependencies that are on things that really aren't part of the solution that we're trying to build. And so how do we handle those dependencies? We have introduced something called Runtime Unlocked Packages. Now, this is in pilot. It's a new feature, and this is going to be the key, I think, Shane, to being able to make sense of and create modules that might have a dependency on something else inside the org that you don't want in the package by creating what we call a Runtime Unlocked Package. This is essentially a virtual dependency, right? So we basically allow you to have a dependency and say, well, this dependency lives in this package. The package doesn't live in my source code. It's a virtual package that's identified at runtime, which represents the rest of the metadata in your org. And so in that way, we can take and not duplicate dependencies, kind of resolve dependencies without having to bring everything down into your source code.
So Dave, I think this is a really key technology, and I'm looking forward to playing around with it. If you think about it, if every developer built second generation packages for every new app, still the Salesforce CRM product is really big, it's really complex, it has a lot of dependencies, and it's not packaged. So this can start to chip away at that complexity as well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's accounts, there's contacts, there's leads, there's things that you want to tie into, relate to your solution, but you don't necessarily need to have those represented in your source code. Otherwise, it's one thing leads to another. It's just like an avalanche of metadata all of a sudden. And so this allows you to basically loosely couple your application to the rest of the metadata in your org. So there's a couple of things about it. It's dependent on a very specific org, right? So that runtime unlocked package represents the metadata in an org. So it won't work with just kind of a generic org. If you go and try to use it with a different org and has a different shape, then it won't work that way. Scratch orgs is not a good place to use this, at least at this point in time. Developer sandboxes that have source tracking turned on. Now, the great thing about Scratch orgs is you can spin them up and tear them down. But the other great thing about it is it tracks the changes that you make through the UI, the declarative things that you do, so that you can reflect those changes down locally. We've enabled that for, I forget what version of Developer Sandbox, maybe Lightning Developer Sandbox, I don't know. And so that would be the environment to use when developing there. Okay, so what's our ultimate goal? Our ultimate goal really is creating applications that our users love, creating customizations, extensions to the various clouds on the platform, implementing business processes, and meeting the business requirements. But the way to get there is, and at scale, is by reducing complexity. And so we give you two things to think about. One is unlocked packages. I highly recommend that you look at these, play with them. They're quite easy. Unlocked packages, second generation packages are much, if you've looked at managed packages and go, wow, there's some restrictions on that thing that I don't really want to adopt, look at second generation packages because a lot of those are removed. The ability to update a package whereby that update involves removing some metadata, we have that capability. Rolling them back is also a capability.
And you know, Dave, I would also mention right now, dev hubs. Dev hubs are really cool. They're like a miniature app exchange for your enterprise. So your developers can put all your packages in your dev hub, and from there you can securely deploy them and test them out.
Yeah, and then this is a key technology for enabling also that CI CD so that your releases are clean and everything. The other thing to think about is, well, how do I get there? How do I reason about what I've got in my happy soup? These are some best practices to think about. I'm not going to read them all off. I think one important thing that any admin in the room should wholly embrace is communication with their users about what is changing and what has been changed. And then there's a little comment that I think deserves a little bit more verbiage, which is with regards to profiles. Profiles are a giant offender in causing dependencies and the inability to separate your org into modules. So really look at moving to permission sets.
Yeah, come see us downstairs if you're having profile problems.
So we've got 2.5 minutes left. Bill, you want to tell us how we can work together?
Sure, absolutely. So this is just kind of a generalization, but you know, developers on the left building unlocked packages, second generation packages, testing things out in Scratch orgs, and using Salesforce DX to build their applications with agile teams. And then those assets, either through packages or repos, flow into the release management process where we start to look at integration testing and acceptance testing, and then on to the final push in production. And so Dave also talked about hybrid models where you can install those packages directly into production. So it's a lot of different ways to skin this cat, but more on the left, we're looking at procedural things and code, and on the right, we're looking at declarative things and clicks. Administrators tend to deal with a lot more different metadata types, and developers are more about writing code on the left.
So this session was billed as the throwdown, showdown between source-based and org-based development. And that's really not the question. The question is org-based deployment, org-based source of truth versus package-based deployment, source-based of truth. And so like you can gradually adopt this release flow. I illustrated that on the 3 slides, right? We don't have to immediately go to the 3rd slide or the 3rd model. We can adopt the 1st model and move from there. Reducing org complexity is a key in being successful at this. And best practices around this are currently being established. We have some, but I think over time more best practices will arise, especially with the advent of Runtime Unlocked Packages. And with that, we have 40 seconds for any Q&A. Now, I realize there's not going to be any Q&A, but if you would like to chat with us, we'll be right outside the room after the session.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
Much.